Do you know why I don't have any houseplants? It's because these thumbs ain't green. That's what we're talking about today as we continue our sermon series called The Party. We're looking at how we live in God's abundance. And I really view the kingdom of God is like a party that God is throwing. He's the host of this incredible party that He's inviting us into seeing His abundance, His generosity everywhere we go. And we see it last week. We began talking about the Garden of Eden and how He has created this abundance everywhere, and that Jesus is actually keying into that garden theme. How He's going, look at the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. They're not anxious about it, yet God gives them. Doesn't God love you more? He's showing us that God has created this abundance in the party for us. But there's a problem. That family ends up enslaved to Egypt. They're literally in the desert. They want to be this great nation in the garden of God's abundance, but now they are in the desert under the hard, stone-hearted Pharaoh and having to do what he wants them to do. Today is going to be kind of a thicker sermon than normal, but this is something I'm talking about today that I was never really taught growing up. And if I did, I was probably being too dense to actually hear it. But I want you guys to hear this because I think it's critical in understanding how God works and how He saves us even when we're beckoning and wanting Babylon in our lives. It's incredibly important to the narrative of the scriptures here. So let's get into it, right? So they're in Egypt and they're held by that stone-hearted Pharaoh there. But God rescues them. He pulls them out of Egypt, takes them to the Red Sea and takes them into the Sinai desert, to God's mountain, gives them the commandments, and they live out there for 40 years. But here we meet them now at the end of that time, and they're about to go into the promised land, a land that is flowing with milk and honey. Wait a second. Wait. Land flowing with milk and honey. Doesn't that sound kind of like the Garden of Eden? Yeah, it does. It's almost like they are going into the Garden of Eden. And we can see that language being talked about, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey in Deuteronomy chapter 11. Listen to it closely here. But the land that you are going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain of heaven. Don't you understand what he's saying there? This isn't like that desert land of Egypt where you had to dig trenches in order to irrigate the fields of the delta of the Nile, right? No, this is a hilly land, and God is going to keep it watered by His rain. A land that the Lord your God cares for. You hear that? He cares for it. He's not leaving it. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. This is a land that's flowing with abundance. It's like the Garden of Eden, and God is always going to be there. This is an amazing gift for them. But how do they treat that gift? Not too well, right? Kind of reminds me of Christmas a few years back. My grandfather got my brother-in-law and I some pretty sweet little RC helicopters. You know, the ones like you see that at the mall where the guy's like throwing it up and catching it behind his back. And we got those and we opened them up and we're like, oh, sweet. And we promptly took them outside. I'm pretty sure in the box we saw later on the warning instructions not to fly them outside, but we promptly took them outside and we flew them all around and promptly destroyed them. You could say that we really weren't good stewards of the gift that we were given. Yeah, that's right. I will say this, that I kept mine away from the trees better than my brother-in-law did, and mine lasted a good hour longer than my brother-in-law's did, which essentially doubled my playtime. But yeah, I mean, we weren't good stewards of the gift that we were given. Neither is God's people. They went into the land and kind of just destroyed it. But before they're even done moving in and conquering the land that God is giving them, that land filled with milk and honey, they begin to go after other gods and other things. their true God just isn't enough for them anymore. And once they get settled into the land, they look at all the nations around them and they begin to whine and complain. We don't have enough. There's not enough here. And if you listen carefully through the story, it's almost like you can hear an old voice, an old voice of the desert coming back again. That kind of has a kind of sound to it, kind of like that serpent that's saying, you don't have enough. God is holding out on you. And they whine and complain, and they look at all the other nations. Oh, we want what they have. Like, we want a king. We want a king like all the other nations have. All the other boys and girls have kings. Why can't we have a king? And God gives them what they want. He gives them over to their desires, but that doesn't satisfy them. And so this is the part where the sermon's getting a little thicker. So I want you to just hold on for just a second, because we saw the Exodus there where they're walking around in the wilderness with God, around God's mountain, and he's giving them all the laws. And we have all these books of the laws like Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. All these things, they're setting up an opportunity for Israel to go into the land, that land of opportunity for them, and for them to experience an Eden-like existence. He's like, here's the plan, here's the way to do it, guys. You can have an Eden-like existence if you just do this. But we end up seeing that they just create another Babylon. They just create another desert out of a garden that God is giving them. Because what's going on in the story right here is that God says, remember, I am the one that took you out of Egypt. I am out there. You were once slaves in Egypt. You were once held down and treated as less than when you were Egypt. And I pulled you out, and I want you to never go back to there. I never want you to ever feel that. And I don't want you to put anyone in that situation. Pretty much to the Israelite, when you look at the law, that slavery was pretty much prohibited. But they forget what God has done for them. And they lust after more and more and more stuff. And they end up mixing with all the other pagan gods all around them. And the storyline then climaxes with Solomon, King Solomon, building the temple of God. And you got to understand what a temple is. A temple is where God dwells, is where God lives amongst his people, where Emmanuel is, right? That he is there in the temple, in that place. And they are building the house of God so that God can dwell with them. And when you read the story in Kings, that you see what's going on, that they are building the very house of God with slave labor. Oh my goodness. Like, do you see what's going on? God has told him have nothing to do with Egypt. And now that's almost like they are taking sand and just throwing it right into God's face. It's like, we'll build your house any way we want to. They're being so cheap and ungenerous because slave labor is cheaper, that they can't spend their own money to build God's house the way he would want it to be built. They have to use slave labor. They're not being stewards of what God has given them. They're only worried about how they can line their pocketbooks more and more and more and more. They are beginning to look like the Babylons all around them, and they're beginning to have hearts of stone like Pharaoh. They're having hearts of stone like Nebuchadnezzar. They're having hearts like all these other lands around them, where they're forgetting the humanity, the image of God in all of these people. This is the push of the Old Testament all through there, that Israel was given these gardens of opportunity as they go through, and they make them into deserts. They are making God's house with slave labor, even though God saved them from being slaves, because they're saying your salvation from Egypt means nothing to us. We are in charge now. This is our gift. We can do with it whatever we want, even if that means making your gift, your land, making it so it looks no different than the Babylons and the Egypts of this world. All of this talk about gardens and deserts really reminds me of the Dust Bowl. You remember the Dust Bowl from like the history book? Well, after the Civil War, there was the Homestead Act of 1862, which basically took a farmer and his family and gave them 160 acres of land between Texas and Nebraska, what's called the breadbasket of the world, right? Basically said, here, you can farm this. They homesteaded it right then. And what's interesting is this group of people must have been a pretty superstitious bunch, because it was mentioned that a popular superstition of the day was that rain would follow the plow and would bless them in an abundant harvest. So they started plowing up all the grasslands. Now the problem is that the grasses had deep root systems that went way down into the ground, and it held the land together. Well, as they tilled it all up to create wheat, that root system began to decay and go away. But everything was okay. People were doing fine. But then something bad happened. The Depression hit, and wheat prices fell out of the heavens. And the farmers kind of panicked a little bit, and they're like, we know what we can do. We're good farmers. We can make it up. We'll make it up next year. And they worked hard, and they worked the land over and over again, and they over-farmed it. And there was no root system to hold the land together. And the wind whipped up the earth and created these giant dust clouds all over the prairie lands there. They took the land for granted. They thought their hard work could have overcome anything that happened. They took the land for granted. They weren't good stewards of what they were given. And they essentially turned the breadbasket of the world into a desert for a time. But they weren't good stewards of the land. And we do the same thing, don't we? I mean, we take the abundance that God has given us, we take the gardens that He's given us in, and we just abuse them and turn them into deserts. One of them is relationships, how we've treated the people that were near us. I know that I've been a terrible friend sometimes. I know I have people that come up to the top of my mind that at some point in our relationship, I quit calling them back. And I think about it often. I think about the deserts that I created there. And I can think of the time that people brought deserts onto me, right? What are the stories about where you made things all about yourself and about just what you wanted? I think some of the easy things we can talk about are money. We were born in this country. We are definitely wealthier than the average bears, and we just use it flippantly. I'm just as guilty as everybody else. Where I'm not as good of a steward as I could be. Where we've been given this amazing abundance all around, and we just kind of hoard it for ourselves. That's what I was talking about last week with the chicken in the pockets and the ranch dressing, because it's weird and it's kind of gross when you recognize it. That there's real need out there, and we're just completely willing to make a desert out of it. As long as the desert's over there, I think this is something that we have to sober up to. It's something that we have to realize, that we, like God's people, have gone astray. That we've decided what was right and wrong in our own eyes, and we haven't been good stewards of the garden, and we're kind of living in a desert now. And I know we're all in different places, but I imagine some of you are like, yeah, my mouth is all dry. It's just sand all around me. There's nothing for me, and I don't know what to do. And you're like, I just don't know if there's any hope. But there's a second principle of God that I want to talk about now. And that is, God is always in the desert, and He always meets us in those times in the desert that we are in. Because remember in God's story that they find themselves in the desert of Egypt, right? They find themselves in this dry, terrible land where they're under control of that hard, stone-hearted Pharaoh, right? They're in that, and God saves them and pulls pulls them out, and he is closest to them as they're wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, that God is actually there with them, leading and guiding them, right? And then they kind of get on their own again as he brings them back into the garden, and they ruin it again, and now they are in another desert. This time it's not Egypt, but it's a desert of Babylon, as they are in exile, as they've been taken over by Egypt, that they are in this exile again. But something happens. They may feel like they're alone, but in the times of desert, that is where God's people meet him again. That we look in all through the Bible, that's where the prophets are written, is that when they were in the desert of Babylon once again. And that's what we see in Ezekiel. And I want to read some of Ezekiel for you because it shows all the stuff that we're talking about today. It says this in Ezekiel chapter 36, "And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you." Now, let's see if you can recognize some stuff that we've been talking about today. "I'll put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the heart of stone." Remove the heart of stone. What is he talking about? He's talking about Pharaoh. He's talking about Egypt. He's saying, I'm going to remove that Egyptian heart of stone out of you, from your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. I will give you a human heart. Again, I will give you a heart that is like the image of God. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. And you shall dwell in the land that I give to your fathers. And you shall be my people, and I will be your God. And then we just skip just a few more for time, right? Down to verse 33. "Thus says the Lord God, on the day that I cleanse you from all your iniquities, I will cause the cities to be inhabited, and the waste places shall be rebuilt. And the land that was desolate shall be tilled, instead of being in desolation that it was in the sight of all who passed by. And they will say," are you ready for this? This is going to sound familiar. Are you ready for this? "And they will say, this land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden." God meets us in the desert places, even the places that we create, where we wanted the trappings of the world, where we wanted the wealth, power, fame, greatness, everything. We wanted political power. We wanted all those things. And we created desert wastelands because we wanted all of that. And he meets us in those desert places and says, I'm going to give you a heart of flesh, a human heart again. I'm going to soften your heart, and I'm going to bring you into those garden places. And that's what we see with Jesus too, because Israel may have gone like, oh yeah, those prophets, maybe it came that God was speaking again, but we're still in captivity. All these captors have come and gone. We saw captors from Babylon. We have seen captors from Assyria. We have seen captors from Greece. And now we are in captivity to Rome itself, and they are overtaxing us and bringing burden after burden after burden onto us. But then Jesus comes and he begins to do all these things like a gardener again. He begins to create life where it seems like there was nothing left. And Jesus is calling out corruption everywhere he sees it, that he's looking at the desert places and he sees those people changing money and charging for sacrifices and turning the temple of God into the Babylon of Rome there. That's just a big financial market. And he begins to turn over all their tables. And we begin to see that the Messiah is back, that he's bringing justice once again. But we see that enrages everybody. And their hearts getting harder and harder towards them, all the way to where they're successful and they successfully kill him. And the sheer ability to kill God made flesh, I think, shows you that Jesus never had a heart of stone, that his heart was always human, was always soft. And it's continually soft even to this day, that he loves us so much enough to even die for us. But he doesn't stay dead, because 3 days later, he raises again on Easter morning. And I love how the Gospel of John tells the Easter story, because these women go up to the tomb and they find the tomb empty. And one of the women's kind of hangs back and she's crying and she senses that someone is behind her. It's actually Jesus. We know this as we read the story, that she senses someone's behind her. And then John gives us a wink, wink, and a nudge, nudge, and kind of a little bit on the nose. And it says, she thought he was the gardener. The gardener. Like she sensed that someone was behind her and she thought it was the gardener. Oh, it's brilliant writing. It's brilliant writing because Jesus is the true gardener. That he's taken all those desert wasteland places that we have created with our own sinfulness and selfishness where we think that there's not enough, and he turns it into a garden. He is the creator, sustainer, maker of everything in the destiny. And he reminds us and shows us by being the gardener. It's like, hey, look at the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. There is enough. Look at the stars in the sky. Can you count them? See how I am making abundance out of nothing each and every day. So God has made all these things. He's made this amazing garden. And yeah, we need to be a good steward of it, right? But there's a human condition, right? We will turn it into sand. We will turn it into a desert. Some of you are going to put chicken wings in a purse at a party. So come on into God's garden of abundance. Come on into his party. Come on into his kingdom. He has made everything for us. There is so much for us in here. Come on into his kingdom of abundance and generosity. Don't wait outside anymore. Just come on in. It's great. It'll be great having you in here. I want you to remember that God loves you, and we'll see you next week.